Good evening and welcome. My name is Julie Norman, and I'm a lecturer at the Centre on US Politics at University College London. It's my sincere pleasure to welcome you tonight to the third event in our Decision 2020 series on the US elections, which is generously supported by the US Embassy in London. Our next event in this series is scheduled for January 19th. Please do visit our website or follow us on Twitter for further information on upcoming events. For tonight's event, the US election and foreign policy, we're absolutely delighted to be partnering with Queen's University Belfast. Special thanks to the Queen's Office of Public Engagement and the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice for making this event possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce our esteemed moderator for this evening, Professor Richard English, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Professor of History at Queen's, who will introduce our expert panelists. Thank you once again, and enjoy the event.
Thank you, Julie. It really is a great pleasure to chair this panel discussion. I'm very grateful to Julie Norman and her UCL colleagues, to the US Department of State, and to colleagues here at Queen's University Belfast in the public engagement team for organising the event on behalf of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. We have a distinguished panel today, and in a moment I'm going to introduce the panellists and then ask each of them in turn briefly to set out their own view of the implications of the US presidential election for Northern Ireland, for Ireland, for the UK, for Europe. There'll then be the chance for the panel to answer your questions, so please do submit those questions by posting them through the Q&A facility on your screens. As I say, we have a very distinguished panel today, and it's a pleasure now for me to introduce them. Elizabeth Kennedy Trudeau took up her post as US Consul General in Belfast in 2018, having previously served as US Consul General in Pakistan, and before that, having worked for the State Department in Washington, D.C. Ms. Kennedy Trudeau has also served as Counselor for Public Affairs at the US Mission to NATO in Brussels and at the US Mission to South Africa in Pretoria. Rory Montgomery is an Honorary Professor in the Mitchell Institute here at Queen's University. In his career as an Irish diplomat, he served as Political Director of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Permanent Representative to the European Union, and Ambassador to France. During 2016 to 19, he worked in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade with responsibility for European issues, including Brexit. Between 1993 and 2001, he worked on Northern Ireland, including his role as part of the team that negotiated the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Jonathan Powell is CEO of Intermediate, the charity which he founded in 2011 to work on conflict resolution around the world. His work has involved negotiations with ETA in the Basque Country and negotiations in Colombia with the FARC. Between 1995 and 2007, Jonathan Powell was Chief of Staff to Tony Blair, and during 1997 to 2007, he was Chief British Negotiator on Northern Ireland. He too is an Honorary Professor at the Mitchell Institute in Queen's, and his influential books include Great Hatred, Little Room, Making Peace in Northern Ireland, and Talking to Terrorists, How to End Armed Conflict. Elizabeth, I'd like to begin with you, if I may. Can you give us your initial sense of the implications of the US election for this part of the world?
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to you and the group for having this important discussion tonight. I have the easiest job. I have to start with a few caveats because I'm a diplomat, so you'll appreciate it. I am a career diplomat. I'm not a political appointee. I joined the State Department under President George Bush. I've served 7 secretaries of state, and I look forward to continuing in this role. I'm going to speak very broadly about the new administration, understanding I don't speak for the new administration. They will be setting their own policies and their own priorities. But speaking about Northern Ireland, it's actually easy to do because Northern Ireland is a bipartisan issue in the United States. I was very lucky earlier this week to join the Public Records Office to mark the 25th anniversary of when President Bill Clinton turned on the Christmas tree at Belfast City Hall. I think some in our audience may remember that it was supposed to be the Power Rangers, and then President Clinton took over the control. Little controversial there, but you know, the people of Northern Ireland are very generous. But it reminded me how long and how bipartisan U.S. engagement has been in Northern Ireland. Some of your audience may know that we're the second oldest U.S. consulate in the world, founded by George Washington. And since that time, though evolving, the United States has had a deep and abiding interest in this place. We're very lucky at the consulate. Many of our colleagues whom we work with have been with us since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, some before. And we really build on that strength. Across administrations, you see consistent involvement and consistent interest. And I would say that we would characterize it by saying it's focused on the people of Northern Ireland. We talk very much about prosperity. We talk about gaining the benefits of the hard-won peace here, but we're also very focused on the future, with the idea that there will be a joint future, that reconciliation is an ongoing process, that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was not a one-off deal, that conversations still need to continue. You've seen engagement through special envoys, presidential special envoys, envoys appointed by the Secretary of State. The people on the call will remember Richard Haass, Mitchell Reese, of course, Senator Mitchell, whose center is very actively involved in tonight. Most recently, President Trump appointed Mick Mulvaney after he left the White House. But the focus of every single one of those individuals, while some of them had very specific focuses, decommissioning, things like that, is to ensure that the United States has a high-level voice that goes back to the White House, that tells the truth, and make sure that there's clarity and transparency on what the people of Northern Ireland want. You also see the US Congress on a bipartisan basis, very engaged in this. You see that there were statements made this week. We're very lucky to have the Friends of Ireland caucus, who follow the events and the policies and the issues here very, very closely. I regularly talk to them. I'm very lucky to have that sort of interest in a post at which I serve. I would also note the people-to-people exchange really is the whole focus of our work. I am told anywhere from 7 to 10 US presidents have their roots in Northern Ireland. Depends on who you ask. I will not make a final determination on that. But every day I'm told, you know, I went over and I worked on Cape Cod on a summer, or I did my grad program there, or my cousin lives in New Jersey. That is something that is unique. And what I tell people in Northern Ireland is that we're fortunate in the United States that you see us as a very diverse, big country, but that we have those deep ties. We have a deep understanding. You know, it's a sense of family. A note on the new administration. I know my colleagues on the panel will also have views on this. While it would not be for me to speak for the incoming administration or the president-elect, what you would note, I think, is analysts are noting that this is an institutionalist administration. These are people who value allies and partners. They value alliances. They value the power of institutions and multilateralism. If you take a look at the president-elect's transition website or any of the multiple papers that the campaign put out during the very long United States campaign, it details very much that focus. That is not minimizing, though, and I don't want to do that, the very real challenges the United States faces internally, domestically at this point. And that's going to be something that the president-elect and his team, if confirmed by the Senate, will need to address. And he and the Vice President-elect, Kamala Harris, have spoken extensively about that. Racial injustice, climate change, and absolutely something we're all dealing with, which is the pandemic and economic impact. So I'm happy to answer questions. I look forward to the conversation from our other panelists. But the top line is the United States cares about Northern Ireland. That won't change.
Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed. Rory Montgomery, turning to you, could you set out your initial impressions and reflections in terms of the topic we're addressing tonight?
Yes, absolutely. And again, many thanks to Julie and the team at UCL, and to yourself, Richard, and colleagues in Queen's. I must say Elizabeth did a very fine job as a professional diplomat in presenting the new administration in an appropriate way. All I will say is that the main transition I had to live through when I was abroad was from Brian Cowan to Enda Kenny, and it may not have been as problematic as the transition which is being played out in the US at the moment. I was going to talk mostly about Europe and the United States' relationship with Europe. I want to make a few specific points and a couple of general ones. First of all, very important to realise, and we in Ireland often don't realise this sufficiently, the US engages with Europe in a whole host of different ways. Obviously, there's the relationship with the European Union, but there's also, of course, NATO, which is of primordial importance. There's the question of the G7, where the US and four larger Europe, the largest European economies, take the European Union itself. You've got the OSCE, you've got the OECD, and of course bilateral relationships, above all in the areas of foreign policy, security, intelligence, where the largest countries have a particularly important relationship. So it's a complex picture, and the United States can operate. I wouldn't use the term forum shopping, but what I will say is that different topics lend themselves to different formats, and of course there's overlap. Clearly, I mean, without again provoking too many blushes on Elizabeth's part, I think I can say that there is, of course, tremendous relief all over Europe at the transition from the current president to the next president. I don't need to labour the point. I think differences in tone and style and substance and experience, and also, as she said, the very important emphasis on relationships, alliances, institutions, and so on. I think there are some issues where cooperation should be moderate, fairly unproblematic. I'm not saying these aren't very difficult issues, but they are perhaps, ones in which, the two sides, the Europeans and the US, will be able to cooperate in a pretty straightforward way. Climate, health cooperation in terms of combating the pandemic and more broadly, and probably relations with Russia as well. But to pick out four, which are perhaps a little more tricky, potentially. First of all, the overall trade and economic relationship. There are often, frictions between the two sides. The whole Airbus-Boeing saga goes back many, many years and through several US administrations. There is a degree of scope for tension insofar as the United States seeks to restore US industry in some ways, to reshore and to focus on a sort of made in America policy. It'll be a much more orderly relationship, however, and I think we're less likely to see tariffs thrown around as a kind of a weapon. Will there be a return to negotiations on a full-scale trade agreement, as was the case in the second Obama administration? Personally, I'm not sure, but I think working together on the World Trade Organization should offer scope for work. Then there's the whole complex of digital issues: tax, data flows, privacy, competition, freedom of speech and speech standards, regulation of artificial intelligence. Sufficient to say that these are extraordinarily complex issues, and they're very difficult in themselves. They're of huge interest on both sides of the Atlantic and around the world. But just to say that we have different approaches, most likely, on some of them. And a further complication is, and this is something we've seen very much in the tax debate, is that, of course, the major digital companies and platforms are all American. And attempts in Europe to regulate them in one way or another can be portrayed in the US as being in some way anti-American. Then there's China, again, up very much on the top of the agenda for both Europe and the United States, ever more so. Both, I think, have become much warier of China, much more cautious about its economic policies and practices. There is a recognition that it is a strategic competitor and in some ways a rival. And there's quite plenty of scope for working together. But there are differences as well, because for the US, China in a way has become a kind of an existential threat. It's a direct competitor for global primacy. And the EU is less involved in this sort of dimension of affairs than the US is. And for example, I don't imagine the EU or would have made such a priority of Huawei without pressure from the Americans. And finally then, on Iran, will it be possible to go back to the deal? This was a huge achievement of the US, the E3 and the European Union. I think it'll be difficult for a range of reasons. I think the geopolitical situation in the region has further changed with kind of a reinforcement of an Israeli-Sunni axis. And I think as well, it was possible at the time of the negotiations to decouple the nuclear issue from the wider question of Iran's regional role. Will that still be possible? I'm not so sure that it will be, but that'll be a big, big issue. Then finally, a broader question, or second from last, the question of strategic autonomy for the European Union. This is more a slogan in a way at the moment than it is a policy. It covers a lot of issues, but fundamentally it's the vision put forward by President Macron that in a range of ways, economic, industrial, security, defence, Europe needs to be able better to stand on its own 2 feet and when necessary, run an independent policy. And there's been an interesting back and forth between Macron and the German defence minister in recent days about the extent to which this remains a necessary priority given the new US administration. And Macron was very much of the view that it is, not least because we don't know who will be in power in 4 years' time. And so these are difficult questions. And a really fundamental question, which may raise its head sometime, relates to the position of the dollar as the sole international reserve currency. That gives the United States, and dollar privilege gives it an enormous additional economic and geopolitical clout, which is probably not justified anymore on the basis of its share of world trade. And certainly if the Chinese push for the renminbi to become a reserve currency, there are those within sort of European economic circles who want to see the euro occupy a similar role. Finally then, so those are issues. I'm not saying there aren't issues where we have much in common on which we can work together, but they may not be easy. And let's remember, even Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had their disagreements at times along the way, so it isn't unusual. Finally then, as regards Ireland, just very briefly indeed, I won't talk about Brexit or Northern Ireland particularly. I mean, obviously the relationship is hugely important to us in Ireland. There are ties, there are human ties, there are cultural ties, there are ties of ancestry. Also, more to the point, in particular with the departure of the UK from the EU, the Ireland's trade and investment relationship with the US is far more significant in relative terms to Ireland and indeed to the US than that of any other member state of the Union. We do the US counts as about 3 times as economically important for Ireland as it is for the EU on average. But I think it's important to realise that because we're not in NATO, that excludes a very large part of the relationship from our purview. And I think at times some of my colleagues and political bosses talk in a sentimental way about Ireland as some kind of bridge between Europe and the US. I don't actually, or interpreter, I don't think the French and the Germans and the Americans indeed need our help, particularly in running a dialogue with the US. But of course, we're always willing to use our good offices, not least in Washington and on Capitol Hill, to promote that kind of dialogue.
Rory, thank you very much indeed. Jonathan Powell, turning to you now, please.
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you, Julie, for inviting me this evening. I'm very grateful to be included. And I think we have 3 species of diplomats this evening. We have a serving diplomat, and we have a recently retired diplomat, and now with me a long time ago retired diplomat. So I can afford to be completely undiplomatic. And as far as I'm concerned, it's untrammeled good news for the world and the United Kingdom to have President Biden coming into office. It gives us predictability. It gives us someone who's committed to alliances, someone who's committed to a rules-based system. It gives us experts and professionals back in charge of foreign policy. And as Biden himself has put it, the US is back, and that is important to all of us. I think it creates some pretty big problems for Boris Johnson, partly based on personality, the way he is and the things he's said. and some of his comments about President Obama and Kenya are coming back to bite him now, perhaps not surprisingly. I think he has problems of politics, because Brexit itself is something that was opposed correctly by Vice President Biden and President Obama, and he himself has set himself up as this sort of Trump whisperer, a role that's no longer required. And the populist strand of politics that united him and Trump is now on its wane, we hope. And this matters. I mean, people will tell you that the relationship at the top isn't that important. I can tell you it is. We spent a huge amount of effort with Bill Clinton when Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party, and again with George W. Bush in building a good relationship across the Atlantic. It does matter what the relationship at the top is. Of course, the relationship goes on, but if you want them to cut you some slack, if you want to be able to get some influence, if you want to be able to direct things in a little bit in one direction or another, it matters if you have a relationship at the top. When Wilson didn't have that relationship with LBJ and Heath didn't with Nixon, it mattered. The trouble is there also, as well as this personal relationship at the top, which I think will be frosty to start with at least, is our structural issues underneath that. Most importantly, our foreign policy since the Second World War, and since the demise of the empire anyway, has been based on two pillars, on Europe and on the transatlantic relationship. And the problem is we've just left Europe, so we've taken away one pillar of our foreign policy. And unfortunately, that impacts on our second pillar, on the transatlantic relationship. One of the reasons we were of interest to the United States was that we had a say in Europe. We were, if you like, their Trojan horse inside Europe, and we could argue for things. And we no longer are. We're no longer of as much interest to the United States because of that. As Rory said, we are not going to be a bridge to Northern Ireland as Boris Johnson wants to build. We're certainly not going to be a bridge to the United States. The United States will turn to France and Germany. They won't need an interpreter, and that is a sensible way for them to behave. And in terms of actual what we can offer the United States too, that is much reduced in military terms as much as anything else. Although we put 2 billion more in, our military is in much less able to support than it has been in the past. In terms of the issue of Northern Ireland, I think I unreservedly welcome President Biden's intervention in this issue. I think it's important. He's got a long-term commitment to Ireland and to the Northern Ireland question. And I think anyone who sort of thought he wasn't going to think this was important, let alone think that people in Congress wouldn't think this is important, are curiously ignorant of American politics. And I think making this point about the need to avoid a border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is really important, and all strength to his elbow in making that case. I don't think a trade agreement with the United States was imminent in any case with President Trump in place. Negotiating such an agreement would be incredibly difficult. There is a reason why the EU has not been able to negotiate such an agreement over many decades, and it wasn't suddenly going to happen, whatever anyone was saying. But it certainly isn't going to happen if we breach international law with what we do in Northern Ireland. So I think there's a real problem for Boris Johnson's government from that point of view. I'm not saying that this is the end of the special relationship. In fact, I think the special relationship probably ended some time ago. But it does mean a gradual decline in our importance in the transatlantic relationship. It's been speeded up. And I think what it really does is confronts us with the question of what on earth a global Britain is supposed to be. At the moment, it's a vacuous phrase, and someone's going to have to fill it with some meaning if that's going to be the new basis of our foreign policy rather than the two pillars on which we depended for so long. I think that two factors that will be important in that are that although the US is back, the US is not going to be back everywhere. It will not be able to resume its former hegemonic role. It will be playing an important role in all sorts of places. But will it really be leading in the Ukraine and in Syria? They've made clear their policies, their priorities are domestic, followed by China, China, China. They will be back in a way in leadership, but not in the same way as before. And that means there's a gap, and someone's going to have to fill that gap around the world. And there's also a very interesting question I haven't got time to go into now about liberal interventionism. Many of the people who are coming in have certainly written and indeed acted on liberal intervention in the past. Is that going to be a strand of American? I mean, I personally obviously very much hope so, but let's wait and see if it really is. So I think the interesting thing about Biden's election is it does make the United Kingdom have to face up to this dilemma. Dean Acheson said in 1962, the famous quote about Britain's lost an empire, not yet found a role. We've now left the EU and not yet found a role, and what's it going to be?
Jonathan, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for those very insightful comments, which have already generated a lot of questions. What I'm going to do in the first instance with the first question is ask all three panelists to address it, going in the reverse order. So Jonathan, then Rory, then Elizabeth with this one. And the question is from Tara Grace. And this is the question. It relates to something that Jonathan's just been addressing. The question is this: how will President-elect Biden's commitment to the Good Friday Agreement shape America's engagement with Britain going forward? What will be prioritized? The Irish-American connection or the friendship between Britain and the US? So the comparison between those two special relationships, Jonathan, let's start with you, if I may.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think and hope that what President Biden will be committed to is preserving peace in Northern Ireland. You know, we spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of blood, sweat and tears in arriving at a peace in Northern Ireland, and we hope it's going to be a lasting peace. To drive a coach and horses through it by recreating a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic would be a catastrophic mistake. And I think he's committed to, he always has been, he played, you know, like Bill Clinton and others before him, it's a bipartisan issue and he's played a strong role in doing that. So I don't think it's a matter of him choosing between Britain and Ireland. I, as a Brit, would welcome him playing a role to ensure that doesn't happen. And this arises, of course, if we leave the EU in the next month, or in this month indeed, without an agreement. If we do, we're going to have a problem with this piece of legislation that has gone through breaching international law. That cannot be allowed to stand, and we face a very difficult issue in which the United States will be part of the argument. So I don't think he's choosing between a long historical relationship with the UK and a relationship with Ireland. He's actually choosing to do the right thing, which is to stand up for peace.
Jonathan, thank you. Rory, would that be your view as well on this question of the Irish-American relationship and the British-US relationship?
Yes, it would. I mean, I think we have to hope, first of all, that a deal will be done between the EU and the UK in the coming days, and that the British will implement the Northern Ireland Protocol exactly as it is written and understood. And if that happens, I think then the tensions will dissipate. Just to pick up on a point Jonathan made earlier in his first intervention, this is not, of course, just a question of Biden. It's a bipartisan issue. And I remember I was in the room in Dublin when Nancy Pelosi made her speech about almost 2 years ago now, making very clear that the House of Representatives under her speakership would not endorse a trade agreement with the UK if the UK were in breach of its commitments internationally. Obviously, we have to hope. I mean, as Elizabeth rightly said, there has been engagement through different administrations. It really goes back in a way to the very start to Jimmy Carter and then through Ronald Reagan and so on. But I suppose the intensity of the engagement has been a function really of the necessity of US involvement. And I suppose we have to hope that it's not easy. I think we have to hope that the more the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement can function and the less the threat to peace, then the benevolent support of the US will always be welcome. But let's hope it'll never be necessary again to have US or indeed other third country representatives as deeply involved as has been the case. But if it were to be the case, I'm sure the US would not be found wanting.
Thank you, Rory. Elizabeth, the rival charms of the two special relationships?
I think actually Rory and Jonathan said it perfectly. It's not a choice. And if the United States does choose, we choose the people of Northern Ireland. And that's founded on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, all three strands. And there's a nuance there. And I think frequently the United States is criticized for not recognizing there's all three strands. We do. Rory hit it on the head on the strength of the institutions as well. I think 22 years after the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, you do have institutions that work. You know, what the United States role should be is strengthening that, encouraging, forward progress, and imagining what Northern Ireland looks like for the people who live here. But I would absolutely agree with my other two panelists, who are brilliant.
Thank you. Elizabeth, I'm going to direct the next question at you, if I may. This is for Elizabeth. The question is this: with the deep divisions in the USA highlighted by the election, and with a very complex global context, will Irish issues not struggle to gain attention in the US?
It's a great question, and the audience member who raised it is absolutely correct. America is deeply polarized now, I think, in a profound way that we really don't even recognize. The president-elect, the U.S. Congress, both sides, both parties, as well as those who don't associate with any party, as we would say in Northern Ireland, there's work to do. But there's also work to do as citizens. So I think domestic issues, the polarization, and as I mentioned before, the economic impact of the pandemic, rolling out the vaccines, a lot of those are really going to dominate the president-elect and the vice president-elect's agenda moving forward. That said, this island, as well as the special relationship with the United Kingdom, these are heart issues. These are issues that matter profoundly to members of Congress, members of the president-elect's proposed cabinet, and to the man on the street in the United States. So they're always going to be important for the United States. I would, never prioritize issues for an incoming administration. That would be inappropriate. But I will say is, you notice that there's been questions and the president-elect has answered them. But I'd also say, and Rory raised it, you had Speaker Pelosi here. You also had Senator Roger Wicker here, Senator John Cornyn here, both last year, with a huge delegation who did a very similar trip to Speaker Pelosi's delegation. They went to the border as well. That commitment is bipartisan in the United States. And so I think you'll continue to see that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next question I'm going to ask Jonathan Powell to answer, if I may. This is from Philip, and it relates to something you raised, Jonathan, in terms of those who see the transition from Trump to Biden as a positive thing. The question from Philip is this: how hamstrung might the Biden administration be by Trump's or Trumpism's legacy, and by what he might still do over the next set of weeks, and also if Trump pitches his tent for 2024?
Yeah, again, a very good question. It's I think Iran is the most salient aspect of that, with the death rate in Tehran appearing to go up rather dramatically over the last few weeks. I think the danger is that what he's trying to do is provoke a reaction that the US then has to react to, and Biden is left with a real mess on his hands in the case of Iran. I sincerely hope that doesn't happen, and I think counting down the clock in those terms. But it's also, of course, true in China, where he's also tried to clear the pitch as best he can before Biden gets there. And given this rather unusual sort of transition where you have a president who hasn't still admitted that he's lost, it does make things rather complicated. Nonetheless, 50 days isn't that long, and there's only so much damage you can do in 50 days. Even things like pulling troops out of Afghanistan. In fact, there are many things the military can do to make sure that doesn't happen in its entirety in the period that remains ahead of us. So I think Biden will not be completely hamstrung by what he's left. And in many ways, the reaction to him is going to be so overwhelmingly welcoming around the world. He'll be enjoying a great honeymoon with leaders pretty much everywhere else, with the possible exception of Mr. Putin. So I think his problem may be more with the Senate. And if he doesn't win the Senate in Georgia, which looks a little bit unlikely, then he's going to have trouble getting ambassadors and officials confirmed. And that will lead to an even longer delay in policy being implemented or created in the US than usual. And some of these policy issues can't wait. And so I think that will be his main constraint. Trump running again in 2024, I think, is a problem for the Republican Party rather than a problem for President Biden in his foreign policy.
Thanks, Jonathan. A question here which I'm going to ask Rory to answer. This is from Ewan, who's contacting us from London, and says, regarding the several comments that have been made about the US approach to Ireland and Northern Ireland matters being bipartisan, the question is, how bipartisan is it, Ray, the two communities in Northern Ireland? Rory?
Well, I think what I would say to that is, well, first of all, I think Elizabeth very clearly explained that the United States wishes to engage with everyone in Northern Ireland. It does engage with everyone in Northern Ireland, and it is supportive of all of the institutions which are an interlocking totality, if you like. Now, it's true that politically, insofar as there are Irish Americans active in politics, or those who identify as Irish American, they are more likely to be from a Catholic/nationalist background. there, as we know, going right back to the Troubles and before, there have been politicians who have, adopted a rather unbalanced approach. But I think it's fair to say that successive administrations, in particular, have been remarkably attentive to the needs and wishes and problems of both communities. And now at times they have been objectively required to focus their attention on one community more than another. I mean, Bill Clinton obviously put a huge amount of effort into prodding the IRA along the road to its ceasefire and thereafter. But equally, it's important to remember that Mitchell Reese and Richard Haas under George W. Bush were able to establish a good connection with the DUP, and also were very important in pushing the IRA along the final steps towards decommissioning. So I think, despite the fact that if you look at sort of, insofar as there is Irish American public opinion, yes, it tends to be more nationalist than unionist, much more nationalist than unionist. And in fact, a lot of what Irish diplomats had to do in the US during the Troubles was to try to put forward a more moderate and balanced and realistic view of the situation. But at the level of the administration, and in fact, I think of the Congress in general, there is a good understanding of the needs and requirements of both communities and the need for balance.
Thanks, Rory. Elizabeth, here's a question I'm going to ask you to address. The person hasn't given their name, but it's a very good question. And the question is this: is there any chance that a post-Trump world might develop kinder global economic relationships that work for ordinary people who've been left behind by globalization?
I think it's a question a lot of Americans are asking, as well as people around the world. It's a question of where we evolve, I think, as a global community. And I don't want to give a wishy-washy answer to that. That was pretty much a yes-no answer. But the short response is, I don't know. You're living in a very capitalist society. You're looking at a very profit-driven world. And you're also looking at a world right now, because of the pandemic, that has been forced into very difficult, problematic economic choices, including huge debt burdens now. I think what you saw with the United States is some dialogue, particularly on the more liberal side of the Democratic Party in the run-up to the election, talking about humanizing politics, talking about, what you would call here is a basic wage. You're talking about healthcare. You're talking about education. These are norms. The idea that it's still up for discussion, I think, is interesting to our allies and partners around the world. But in the United States, these are real issues. So the short answer, I don't know. But I think that you do find Americans willing to have the conversation now. Do we need to talk more, particularly about racial inequality, about economic inequality? We absolutely do.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Here's a question which relates to the US and EU. I'm going to address this one to Rory. A question from Peter. And the question from Peter is, how will US-EU interaction on foreign policy and security issues be shaped in the new circumstances of a Biden administration and Brexit? Rory.
Well, I think that's I'm on air, I think. Yeah. No, that's a very good and important question. I mean, of course, there will be all of the institutional connections at a whole range of levels. I think there will be a great desire for President Biden to meet both the President Michel and President von der Leyen before too long. There'll be, Secretary of State, High Representative relationships. There'll be relationships with individual member states. We hope there will be a very professional US ambassador to the EU, which has normally been the case, though not always, as we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years. So I think there are many factors which will, structural factors, which will lead to a more intense and more structured and more orderly dialogue. I think, it's when it comes to the individual issues, I mean, I sketched out some of them earlier, and I won't repeat myself. Suffice to say that insofar as the overall relationship is positive and respectful and orderly, it's easier to deal with what could be very difficult questions. And as I say, you have to remember, like I said as well earlier, that many of these questions arise in different ways in sort of a different set of formats. Finally, then, as regards Brexit, well, I mean, Jonathan spoke about the special relationship. I mean, I think there's no doubt that the relationship with the UK will still be very important. And I think a fascinating question would be this. The EU and the UK will have to establish a relationship in foreign and security policy. It had originally been the hope and expectation that that would form part of a future relationship agreement. The UK has, I think, for principally ideological reasons, avoided that topic completely in the negotiations. But inevitably, for reasons of geography and interest, there will have to be a degree of cooperation. And I think, in fact, to the extent that the US and the EU are able to cooperate on issues which are also of concern to the UK, and the issues I mentioned, Iran, China, etc., are all of interest to the UK, then I think, in a sense, the UK might find it easier to deal with the EU in a somewhat broader context, at least to begin with, than bilaterally with the EU. So, in fact, I think that's a further positive dimension of a Biden White House relating to the EU.
Thanks, Rory. Jonathan Powell, a question I'm going to address to you, if I may. This is from Emily, and she asks, what do you think is the real reason that Trump won't concede?
Well, I can be a little bit cynical. I think that reading in the New York Times today that he's raised so far, I think it's 170 million for his defense fund, none of which is actually being spent on the legal fees, and all of which is going to his future campaigning and travel. So it is a very good money spinner. It is a very good way of keeping himself relevant. It helps him psychologically because he doesn't like the idea of being a loser, in inverted quotes. So I think it's really for all of those reasons. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if he declares that he's going to run in 2024. I'd be slightly more surprised if he actually does run in 2024, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if he does say that. And as I say, that raises quite a big problem for the Republican Party, because that will suck a lot of oxygen and life out of them for the next 4 years. So I think it's, to be honest, to do with that rather than some deep belief that he hasn't in fact lost. If his Attorney General is saying that he's lost, his Attorney General has done some pretty nefarious things on his behalf, I think even he has probably accepted he's lost, but it doesn't suit him to say so.
Thanks, Jonathan. We've got a question here from Alexandra, which is a question I suspect directly specific to Elizabeth. So I'm going to start with you, Elizabeth, but I'm going to broaden it out to ask a version of it to Jonathan and to Rory as well. And the question from Alexandra for you, Elizabeth, is what advice would you give American students studying in the UK if they want to join organisations like yours? And I'm going to ask Jonathan and then Rory to talk about advice more broadly to students thinking of engaging in the kind of careers that you've all engaged in. But Elizabeth first.
Alexandra, I love that question. Thank you for that. Okay, get a pen, careers.state.gov. I will say this, and I'm sure Jonathan and Rory will chime in. Being a diplomat representing your country is an honor, and it's a privilege, and it's a fantastic job every day. There's all sorts of ways to do it. As a student, you can start being an intern. As an American, there's a program called the Presidential Management Fellows, which is a pathway to joining not only the Foreign Service, but a range of government agencies. It's wonderful. You know, there's very few careers in the world where you are worldwide available. You know, tomorrow they could call me up and tell me I'm going to Beijing, or they could tell me I was going to Mogadishu, or they could bring me back to Washington, D.C. I was lucky to go to Belfast. So take a look at the website. Richard's got my contact detail. The good people at Queen's, I'm sure could help hook us up. But also, there's lots of information too on the U.S. Embassy's website. But careers.state.gov has got the information. I went to school for journalism. Don't think that you have to go to school and study international affairs. Though Rory and Jonathan may disagree with me. Some of the very best diplomats I've met have come from a range of backgrounds. And we want a foreign service that looks like America. That's most important. So think about it.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for the question.
It's a great question. Jonathan, a version of the question to you. If you were advising a student who was thinking about the sort of career that you've engaged in, what advice would you give them?
Well, I would echo what Elizabeth said about being a diplomat, and actually, particularly if you're an American student, being an American diplomat, because the State Department, despite what it's been through over the last 4 years, and just managerially in other ways, it's had some real difficulties. It is an extraordinarily strong institution. I mean, because it does look more like its country than perhaps our own Foreign Service does, it's extraordinarily able to deal with issues like Korea and South America in ways we just can't even think of. The depth of knowledge, and I really have, throughout my years, been impressed by the State Department and its ability to do things almost regardless of its political masters. Since I left government 13 years ago, I've been running an NGO which I established. And I would say also it is worth thinking not just about government, and increasingly actually as the world continues along its merry path, there are roles to be played elsewhere in some of the charities like Save the Children I was on the board of until recently, but also the UN and places like that. And I'm particularly interested in conflicts. And if you're interested in conflicts, there's often a best way. If you can learn a language, learn Arabic in particular, go and work for a UN mission in Libya or in Yemen or somewhere like that, and get some real experience on the ground of how to work in conflicts, and how to try and resolve them.
Thank you, Jonathan. Rory.
Yes, I mean, I would largely echo what Jonathan and Elizabeth have both said. I mean, it is in general, I had a wonderful career in foreign affairs. It's not always easy. It's not always easy on families. And at times, in fact, it's rarely easy on families probably. And, in terms of personal circumstances, they can change. But one of the things I would say, certainly as far as the Irish public service is concerned, is there's much more mobility now into and out of and back into the Department of Foreign Affairs to be the case. What I would say is that the average age of people joining the department as diplomats has gone up maybe 4 or 5 years since my time. So now, I think the expectation would be that you would have maybe done at least a master's, done a range of internships, lived abroad, all of that. And that would be important. But again, as Elizabeth said, we have people from all sorts of academic backgrounds in our department. There are, masters in chemistry, PhDs in biochemistry, an architect. We've had a whole range of people. I was history, many of us were, others European studies, but by no means all of us. And then again, just as Jonathan put in a plug for NGOs, rightly so, I also think it's worth considering, if you're qualified by nationality, to think of joining the European institutions, the European Commission, obviously the External Action Service, but also bodies like the Council of Europe and the OSCE. They offer very interesting opportunities as well.
Thanks very much. Some excellent advice there, Alexandra, and for other people listening as well from all three of our panelists. Elizabeth, the question which I'm going to pose to you, will President Biden, this is from Tony, will President Biden be hampered by a perception that he's likely to be a one-term president?
I wouldn't get ahead of the president-elect's determination on that, and I wouldn't make assumptions on anyone not running for a second term.
Excellent, concise answer. Thank you. Here's a question which I'm going to start with Elizabeth here, but I also value the comments of Jonathan and Rory as well on this one, because it has a global dimension as well as a US one. But Elizabeth first, does the panel think the new administration can turn around the US's problematic relationship with women's rights as a result of the Trump administration? Elizabeth.
I would start by noting that the premise is pretty broad brush. That there is a premise there that disregards some of the real strategic work that the United States has continued to do, and that's across administrations. Within my own organization, the Global Women's Issue Office has done extraordinary work. A lot of grassroots work. And frankly, that's where a lot of the initiatives, the mindset change needs to happen. On a broader scale, it's also representation matters. And Vice President-elect Kamala Harris is a watermark for the United States. So I think that's significant. But you also have role models like Speaker Nancy Pelosi. You have role models like then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. So I wouldn't discount, a president as setting a tone for what U.S. policy is. That said, can the United States do more to advance women's rights globally? Of course we can. Do I think the president-elect will prioritize that? He said so during the campaign. This is a fundamental economic and social win for the world. So it makes sense.
Thank you. I mean, broadening the question out a bit from the specific of women's rights, I suppose I'd be interested in Rory and then Jonathan's views about the degree to which the changes that were indicated or attempted by President Trump in terms of certain social questions will prove to be a sea change, or will be things that will be reversed. How significant a shift was the period as we're looking at it now in terms of the social politics? Maybe start with Rory.
Sorry, maybe you might just be a little more precise. So which social policies in particular?
Well, policies in terms of attitudes towards immigration, policies in terms of attitudes, the sort of social aspects of the right-wing shift.
Gotcha. No, I understand. Yeah. No, I think, again, and I think Elizabeth made this point, a huge amount, of the US's credibility and power internationally is, as we all know, soft power. And also to the extent that the United States, is a strong, vibrant, tolerant country itself, the greater the impact it can have internationally. So I would say, I think whatever happens domestically in the US is going to be critically important from that regard. I suppose a more general point is a lot of these issues, to the extent that the US fully re-engages with international organizations within and outside the UN system, whether it's the Human Rights Council, whether it's the UN High Commission for Refugees, whether it's the International Organization for Migration, there are many such. I mean, the more it will bring to the table, and the more its voice will be heard. I think it's funny because I think there was an interesting point made recently by Gideon Rachman in the FT, where he said that there are American liberals who kind of assume that a liberal multilateral order is by definition a US-led multilateral order. And while the US remains the most important player in that order, again, as Jonathan said, and as I think the EU strategic autonomy debate shows, the question of sort of, unquestioned US hegemony, or even its desire to exercise such hegemony, is moot. But as I think the US can play a really decisive role in a whole range of areas of this sort. And again, another very obvious one will be, one hopes, it's rejoining and playing a leading role in the WHO and in combating the present pandemic, but also making preparations. And climate, of course, is absolutely the other cardinal issue of that kind.
Thanks, Rory. Jonathan, your reflections on the degree to which there's been a likely lasting shift on certain social political questions because of the Trump period?
I think if President Trump had lasted in power for 8 years, he would have changed things in a fundamental way that would be very hard to reverse, both in the United States and outside. I think the fact that he is lost after one term means it is easier to change those things. I think we see that in terms of the diversity of appointments that the new administration has already made, which would put our own government to shame. I think we'll see that in changes they make to policy immigration, but also things like the Planned Parenthood changes, which were very difficult for us in Save the Children in terms of what we're trying to do around the world. But I don't think we should ignore the battle that will take place between progressives and moderates within the Democratic Party that will influence the way this administration operates. There will be a battle for the party's soul that will impact on the administration abroad as well as at home.
Thanks, Jonathan. Elizabeth, the question for you, this is from Sarah, and it's about the fact that only a small percentage of voters abroad cast votes in the presidential election. And the question is, how do we ensure that more registered voters in Northern Ireland, the UK and Ireland exercise their franchise?
It's another excellent question, and really kudos to everyone who's throwing these out. It's hugely important. Voting is the responsibility of a citizen. It's not just a right, it's a responsibility. That said, governments, and I'd point the finger at myself and my own. You know, it's our job to make sure it's easy. It's able to be processed quickly. There's transparency. You can track your ballot. I think as many people around the world found out this year, the US voting system is very localized, and each state has its own sort of mechanics and tracing and regulations that govern it. So it's a question of education. It's a question of motivation, and it's a question of making it easier. But yes, votes matter. You're looking at races in the United States where it's coming down to dozens of votes. As a citizen, it's your job.
Thank you. We've got time for each of the panelists to address one final question, please. And the question is this, it's from Shannon. And I think, again, it's a very good question. What role can US citizens living in the UK and Ireland play to ensure lasting peace and cooperation among the nations? So Elizabeth, then Rory, then Jonathan. What role can US citizens living in the UK and Ireland play to ensure lasting peace and cooperation among the nations? Elizabeth.
The last phrase sort of captures me. Among the nations of the world, among the nations of these islands. I'll speak, you know, as broadly as I can, and it sort of goes back to sometimes students or tourists or visitors or business people ask me. They say, "Well, what do you do if people ask you about U.S. politics, or they ask you about racial injustice in the United States, or they ask you about poverty?" And I said, well, tell the truth. You know, we're not perfect. America has always been a work in progress. The joke, and I don't know who said it, though it's been ascribed to many people, is America will always do the right thing after it's tried everything else first. I don't think that's exactly true. But what I would say is, you know, as a U.S. student, engage, tell the truth, represent your country. You know, don't shy from being proud of what you are and who you are. And that's in the whole complexity of what being an American is. And that's being proud of your heritage, if you're an immigrant, or if you're a Native American, or if you're fifth generation, or if your ancestors came over on the Mayflower. It's owning what that is, and owning both our challenges and where we see our future as a country.
Thank you. Rory, benign contribution by US citizens living in Ireland and the UK?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it brings me back to my days as the editor of a college magazine, and we published a piece by a man who went on to be an award-winning US journalist making fun of Jimmy Carter. And I remember there was a little delegation of US students to see me in my rooms to complain about this lèse-majesté. But no, I think, look, I mean, first of all, I mean, U.S. citizens, like people from everywhere, by playing a part as good and concerned citizens in the life of their adopted countries, you know, and in their interactions with friends and neighbours and colleagues, you know, can make a difference on these issues as on others. But just one other point. I mean, Elizabeth talked about the person-to-person contacts, and I think we have to realise the tremendous interplay between you know, the U.S., Ireland, and Britain. The enormous number of Americans who come over to study in Ireland and in Britain, all sorts. There's a wonderful scheme set up a number of years ago called the Mitchell Scholarships, which bring about 12 American postgraduates a year to a whole range of Irish universities, in a whole range of subjects. And the great majority of these are not Irish Americans, but they're learning about Ireland. And equally, there are people who go on the Washington Ireland program from here. When my wife and I were in Washington a year or so ago, we were taken around the Capitol by an intern for Congressman Brendan Boyle, and he came from Galway, and he'd been in Washington all of 2 weeks. So he was about to read to us the significance of various statues and so on in the Capitol. So the human connections are extraordinary, and I think that's a really important dimension as well in the promotion of mutual understanding and connections.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Yes, well, I agree with Elizabeth and Rory, of course. An American interest in Ireland and Britain goes back really a very long way. If you look back at 19th century presidents, they were constantly intervening in the question of Ireland, and thank goodness they were, to be honest. I do think it's important to try and be balanced. It is a danger of thinking there is only one side. in Northern Ireland. There are such people as unionists and loyalists, as well as Republicans and nationalists, and I think they sometimes get lost. I mean, my job in the embassy in Washington back in the early 90s was to go and late 80s, early 90s was to go around trying to explain to people on the Hill and to take unionist leaders to see American politicians. And I think ignoring their interests is a mistake. And so I think sensitizing people back home that there's more than one type of Northern Irish person, but also focusing, as I said earlier, on the cause. And the cause is maintaining the peace. And that's the point of the Good Friday Agreement. And anything that ordinary citizens can do to support the maintenance of that peace is really worth doing. And I think it's going to come under quite a lot of strain, not just because of Brexit, but because of the way this government has acted. I think we are likely to face a fracturing of the United Kingdom. We look at the opinion polls in Scotland now, where you are getting a sustained majority for an independent Scotland. That doesn't mean it will be sustained, forever, but it is there. And in Northern Ireland too, we face the question eventually of people demanding a border poll if opinion polls start to show level pegging there, which it doesn't at the moment. So I think we're likely to go into a pretty difficult period over the next decade. And so I think anyone can do, a US citizen or anyone else here, to focus on the peace, focus on tolerance and maintaining those identities, but there are two identities, would be a good contribution to peace and to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's been a wonderful discussion. In closing it, thank you very much to those who've contributed to organising tonight's event. Thank you to you, the audience. Wonderful questions. We've got through as many as we can, and they were terrific and provocative, but in particular for a wonderful set of insights. I'm sure we would all like to thank, albeit virtually rather than in person, the wonderful contributions from Elizabeth Kennedy Trudeau, from Rory Montgomery, and from Jonathan Powell. Thank you very much indeed for a wonderful session.